So when we talk about awakening, we're using our mind, which I just mentioned, divides things. So you can't talk about the truth without obfuscating the truth. In the Daodejing, which is the classic text of Taoism, one of the key classic texts, the first line is, the way that can be conveyed is not the constant way. Then, of course, there's 80 more chapters after that one. So people can't talk about it, but we try, and there's a good reason for trying, is because it's a pointing, and it's can be a transmission of something behind the words. So I wanted to talk a little bit about why, what happens when we start to talk about awakening and about the truth is that we start to talk about two things right away because of that divisive nature of the mind. But anytime we try to grok the truth, any which way we look at it, it's going to be broken into at least two things, at least two. So the Daodejing, the name of that classic text, means the way and its virtue, the Tao and the Da. It's the classic Jing of the Tao and the Da. So the Tao is the way or the truth. The Da can be translated different ways. Often it's translated as virtue or power. But virtue has a better, I think, gets the essence across a little bit better. But it's basically, what does it mean to walk the path? How do we walk the path? So we have this truth, which is sort of like a, we're not separate. We're all one. But it's sort of like a heady thing. It's sort of like a mental, almost can be just like a mental kind of thing. So then what's the virtue? What's the way that we actually practice that? How do we live our life based on that? So we always have those two sides of this. We're always going to have, on one hand, our experiences of no self, our experiences of bliss or love or connection or transcendence. And then we're going to have waking up in the morning and, barely being able to make it to the coffee maker. And then, oh no, I've got all this stuff to do today. And how do I do that? What's the reality of life, right? Another of these key pairs of the way that we talk about things here at the center and in general in the spiritual discourses, you have the truth and then you have love. So Joel, our teacher here, Joel likes to talk about these as two wings of the bird of ultimate reality. You can't fly without both wings. You need them both. You can't just have the truth. You can't just have love. He says, truth without love is impotent, and love without truth is blind. Right? So you need to have them both. Another way of thinking about this is knowledge and being. So knowing and being, we know. How do we know that we know? We don't really know, we just know we know, right? How do you know that you're aware? Well, you see my head moving? I mean, that's in your awareness, right? So how do you know that? You don't. It's just it's a given. And being, how do you know that you are? It's the same. It's another given. You are, and you know. And so we have both of these. So the real question here, and this is kind of what I'm talking about today in general, is how do we manifest our realization in the world? How do we walk our talk? How do we actually make it transform ourselves, transform those around us? How do we do that? It's not going to be satisfying to just have an intellectual understanding of, no self or God or something. And it's also not going to be satisfying to just have sort of a one-sided experience of the divine. Like, meditation's great, but then I get up and life sucks. Or I still have feelings that I don't want to feel, so I try to stay in this sort of happy place, right? The simple two-word answer to this question of how to manifest your realization is be real, right? So the realization is the knowing part. The be real is the being part. Again, it's the Tao and the Da, the way and its virtue. To this point, the Chinese mystic Zhang Zai, in a text called Enlightenment Resulting from Sincerity, he writes, "When the way or principle of heaven and the nature or desires of humanity function separately, there cannot be sincerity. When there is a difference between the knowledge obtained by following the way or principle of heaven and that obtained by following the nature or desires of man, there cannot be perfect enlightenment. What is meant by enlightenment resulting from sincerity is that in which there is no distinction between the way of heaven as being great and the nature of humanity as being small." Let's read it one more time. This is a really good one. It says, when the way of heaven, you can translate way or principle, so I'll just use way. When the way of heaven and the nature of man or humanity function separately, there cannot be sincerity. When there is a difference between the knowledge obtained by following the way of heaven and that obtained by following the nature of humanity, there cannot be perfect enlightenment. What is meant by enlightenment resulting from sincerity is that in which there is no distinction between the way of heaven as being great and the nature of humanity as being small. So you get what he's saying? He's saying if you have a knowledge of the way of heaven, of the truth, all these big awakening even, you have a big awakening, you have this knowledge, this direct seeing, or even maybe a glimmer of it. If there's any difference between that and the way that you are as a human, your desires, your nature, your emotional functioning, your life, the course of your life, if there's a difference, then that's not perfect enlightenment. So, how do we proceed to begin to become more sincere? This sincerity is really, it's a very important thing. It's an inner sincerity. It's expressed outwardly, but it's about being real with ourselves. So there's kind of two things you can say. So there's some simple instructions that I've been given from some of my teachers that I think are useful. One of my teachers, Robin Michelle Jones, she's a biodynamic craniosacral therapy teacher. She often says, notice that you're noticing. Notice that you're noticing. So this is this truth. This is the way of heaven, to notice that you're noticing. This is knowledge, knowing, awareness, right? And another of my healer teachers, Georgia Milne, she says, feel what it feels like to feel what you're feeling. Feel what it feels like to feel what you're feeling. So I like to think of it this way, that the way and its virtue can be summed up by combining these two. So notice that you're noticing that you feel what it feels like to feel what you're feeling. So it's the whole thing, right? Usually we get stuck one place to the other. Usually we notice that we're noticing, and there's a feeling, and then we're distracted. Or maybe we go to the heart, okay, I feel love, but we don't feel the resistance to the love. We don't want to go there. We just want to skip over that. So there's something here about a deepening. We live in our head so much, especially we've got a culture with gizmos that keep us in our our thought field. It's a very thought-filled culture. I mean, the information age is about, there are more thoughts available more of the time now than ever before. I remember I read somewhere that the average person who's hooked into the internet, average American, I guess, sees more images, different kinds of images, more of different kinds of images in 1 week than the average person 100 years ago would have seen in their lifetime. Right? So we're in our head a lot. We're in this thought field. And we have this tendency to stay there and not to descend into the depths of our experience, which might be suffering, might be even agony. But we try to stay above it. Or it might just be a little simmer, a little bit of, we said little bit of dukkha. Dukkha means unsatisfactoriness. It's often translated as suffering, but in Buddhist terminology, really it's more of a general term, unsatisfactoriness. Buddha said life is unsatisfactory. You know, the conventional life, diluted life is what he means. So we have to find the source of this unsatisfactoriness within the unsatisfactoriness itself, not somewhere else. So where is that? Well, it's in our feeling what we're feeling. So in other words, if I could sum this up in 5 words, I had 2 words, that's be real. 5 words is get out of the head. Get out of the head. You know, we like to come here and talk. This is a talking place. We do that really well here. But what are we always saying? It's not in your thoughts. We're talking and using thoughts to point beyond thoughts. Another way you could say it is we use the mind to uproot the mind. Ramana Maharshi, the great Hindu mystic of the last century, he used the analogy that it's like stirring a fire with a stick. Is it, puja, spiritual practice. It's like stirring the fire with a stick, and the stick is the mind. And when you're done stirring the fire, you throw that stick in too, and it gets burned up. And so in Zen, they use the term no mind to describe the mind of enlightenment, awakening. No mind. There's something that happens, the mind opens. But freedom is not an up and out escape route. That's not freedom, because that's still just the way of heaven. That's separate, that's not sincere. That's separate from the nature and desires of humanity. So the nature and desires of humanity is not up and out, it's down and in interconnection. So one way that it is experienced, many people who have subtle energy type experience in their practice, and not everybody's that way, but one way that's experienced is that there's 2 main subtle energy currents. Of course, there's lots of channels and all sorts of things in the body, but there's 2 main currents. There's this ascending current, which is expansion, levity, spacious awareness, and then there's a descending current, consolidating, gravity, embodied present moment awareness, the felt sense, being here now. And we need both. We have both of them. They're part of us. In the Chinese medicine, which I practice, we talk about yin and yang. And so we have all of this energy already, but what we want to do is to become more transparent to it. So a lot of what happens as we practice is we become more coherent. There's less noise in our system. It's sort of like the human energy body is a transmitter for consciousness, and we become more refined, more able to get a clear signal, get some of those channels that are kind of far out there, coming from, I don't know, Betelgeuse or the Pleiades or something. And besides these 2 currents, there's also the space within which these currents move. There's the neutral. And the neutral is the heart. It's the center. You've got movement this way, you've got movement this way, but we have our neutral, our center, our seat that we are always operating from. And when we're in deep sleep, our awareness returns to the heart. And this is spoken about in Hindu tradition, in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, and of course the Sufis speak about the heart, but all of these traditions speak about the heart, really. So the heart is the core. But the universe and our life manifests as this interplay between the space of awareness and then the energy moving in the space. So the space in Hindu terminology is likened to the Shiva. The Shiva is the upward current, and also called the destroyer, because what is he destroying? All of these separations, all of the sense of separation, blasted into the clear light, into this expansive union with the unmanifest. And Shakti is the energy that dances within that space and is a love affair. Shakti isn't, oh, this is samsara, it's terrible. No, she is dancing with pure joy. This is love, this whole thing. So that's truth and love, ascending and descending. So for a moment, let's touch in. Let's just do I'll do a little guided meditation, and we'll see if we can't feel this in our body a little bit before I go on and give you more thoughts. I'll give you a few thoughts, and then hopefully you'll have some feelings too. So, again, we want to have a sense of the ground. This is the mother. This is our support. She loves us. She's the Shakti, just like our body's the Shakti. All of the movement in our body. And feel into the pelvic floor, the base of the body, the perineum, the softness at the bottom of the pelvis. And feel how that is really an opening. There's a space there where we are able to connect. We can actually connect into the earth, into the support of the mama. Feel that breathing with the breath, or with a subtler breath, just that connection. And now letting that be, keeping that there, coming up to the crown of the head and the space between the eyebrows, and feeling the more light and refined vibrations in the head. So you could call it kind of the neurological noise. And the awareness of the room, and potentially the awareness out to the horizon around you, if you're used to spacious awareness meditation. And feel how that space around you connects in through the crown into the center of the brain. Charles Ridley calls the brain core. He's got weird names for things. The brain core, the center of the brain, fills with light. It is light. Awareness is light. It's like light. And down through the spinal column, all the way down to the tailbone, connecting back down to that pelvic floor. So we have the love at the base and the truth at the crown. And in between, at the heart, the back of the heart, is our neutral space. So we can let attention settle back into the back of the heart, but not stopping the other process, the connection with the horizon through the crown and the third eye, or the connection with the earth, the mama, through the pelvic floor. But we can rest in this neutral, which is at perfect equipoise, perfect peace, balance, the back of the heart. It's always there, even in deep sleep. So now I invite you to open your eyes if they were closed, but maintain that connection to the back of the heart. And as you listen to the rest of these words that will become thoughts in your head, see if you can't maintain that neutral disposition and the connection to both the space and the support of the earth. So the virtue of the way is about embodiment. It's about embodying our realization, our spacious awareness in our ordinary activities. And this embodiment is a dropping out of the bottom, the clench, the holding on. It's a release. It's a surrender of the personal will, surrender of this, I got to figure out what to do. Really, it's a surrender to love, ultimately. And that's what it is. It's a surrender to love. Because love is the truth. See, it's both sides, both wings. Of course, this requires faith. And by faith, I don't mean blind faith or belief. I mean faith in love. Love and faith to me are the same thing. Tenli Norbu Rinpoche has a great chapter in his book, White Sail. He's a Tibetan Buddhist teacher. He's passed, but one of our Sangha members who's in California, one of our teachers, Andrea, she studied with him. He's a great teacher, great writer, and his chapter is called Love and Faith. And he talks about this. Faith is love for the divine, basically. And he uses Tibetan Buddhist terminology. But it's love for that which is transcendent. And so in that sense, that kind of love is eternal, because the transcendent doesn't come and go. It's always with us. So faith is like to me, it's like the ember. You know, there's, in Joel's 7 stages of the path, the first stage is awakening of faith. It's like you recognize something. Oh, there's something there. And it's like a little ember, you know, and you're, you know, like when have you ever seen somebody start a fire with sticks, you know, and they get a little ember going in the moss, and then they blow on it and get it going, and pretty soon there's a big raging fire. That process, though, can take a long time, especially, you know, the first time you've made fire from sticks. I've talked to people that have done it, and it, you know, it can take them days to get it going. So, you know, it's true. So, I mean, it really can feel like a long time to get the faith going. But this is trust in the God or the divine, however you want to put it. And ultimately, the surrender requires an exhaustion of effort on my part, on our part, to make things better. It's not that you don't keep working and you don't keep helping and you don't keep showing up, but that effort to feel better, you start to see how that's a strategy to avoid feeling what you're feeling. And so the more you recognize that, the more you can sink into this knowing that comes through being. And this would be what they call the spiritual death, the true death, which is the death of the personal will. It's not just the death, it's not just an opening to seeing the clear light. It's really a thorough house cleaning. Seeing through the ego mind, which our Sangha member Clavan likes to call the thought wad. I think it's good. So it's the thought wad. Seeing through the thought wad, of course, is super important, but it's really kind of like the gateway. It's the beginning. It's the opening. It's the space that when you see this, then you can really start to deepen your practice. And then, you know, there's degrees of seeing it, and everybody's a little different. But this kind of awakening, the seeing through the thought wad, is not usually complete enlightenment. Like, what was that guy's name? Zhang Tsai said. It's not fully sincerity. It's not enlightenment resulting from sincerity, because it's, generally speaking, for most of us, it's an aha moment when we realize finally how things are. We see clearly how things are really. Bojo Jinul, a Korean Zen master, he writes about a practitioner who has had Kensho or Satori. He says, seeing his own original nature, he discovers that the ground of this nature is innately free of defilement, and that he himself is originally endowed with the non-outflow wisdom nature, which is not a hair's breadth different from that of all the Buddhas. Should I read it again? Okay. Seeing his own original nature, and I apologize for the masculine pronouns. These are in the text. But I'm just going to go with it, since otherwise I'll keep messing up. Seeing his own original nature, he discovers that the ground of this nature is innately free of defilement, and that he himself is originally endowed with the non-outflow wisdom nature, which is not a hair's breadth different from that of all the Buddhas. So that's clear seeing, that's awakening, Kensho. Right? So from this moment on, one's practice stops being guesswork or imitation and becomes informed by real understanding, by knowing, the knowing. We're talking about knowing, truth. In Zen, this is known as sudden awaken, gradual cultivation. So Bojo Jinul continues. Although he has awakened to the fact that his original nature is no different from that of the Buddhas, the beginningless habit energies are extremely difficult to remove suddenly. And so he must continue to cultivate while relying on this awakening. Through this gradual permeation, his endeavors reach completion. He constantly nurtures the sacred embryo, and after a long time he becomes a saint. Hence, it is called gradual cultivation. This process can be compared to the maturation of a child. From the day of its birth, a baby is endowed with all the sense organs just like everyone else, but its strength is not yet fully developed. It is only after many months and years that it will finally become an adult. The image of the sacred embryo comes from Taoist internal alchemy texts. So the Zen people have a lot of Taoist influence. It's a Buddhist school, but it has a lot of Taoist influence. So they use some of those terminology, some of that terminology. This thing about being a baby, though, Adyashanti also talks about it. He says, well, you have an awakening, you're a baby Buddha. Now you've got a little bit to learn still. Chogyam Trungpa also speaks about this. He said, and Chogyam Trungpa was a Tibetan Buddhist Rinpoche. He was really instrumental in bringing Tibetan Buddhism to the United States. He said, having received transmission and having had some kind of realization, you have to follow it up. You have to become liberated. Some people think realization is liberation, but in our case, it is not. When you realize something, you have to practice that realization, and then you are liberated. So realization does not mean you are liberated. It means that you have just touched on the possibility of liberation. Realization is like seeing the first rays of sunshine on the horizon. You know that the sun is in the sky. I remember when I first had my awakening and I went to Joel and he said, and he was trying to judge my experience. He said, are you enlightened? And I'm like, well, I know that the sun is in the sky. And that's exactly what Chogyam Trungpa said. And little did I know that I was still a baby Buddha. Still had a lot of learning to go through. And I think this is for most of us, this is the case. We're a baby Buddha, we know where the sun is. Rick Archer, some of you guys know from Buddha at the Gas Pump, he likes to quote, and I haven't watched many of them, but I've watched the one they did with Joel, which I think is good, and some of the other ones. And I've seen him several times quote this saying, which he claims is Tibetan Buddhist saying. He says, don't confuse understanding with realization, and don't confuse realization with liberation. So I think in the contemporary spiritual discourse, a lot of times people confuse realization with liberation. And it has to do with, well, we have to walk our walk. We have to practice the virtue, and we have to have this disconnection with the earth and the descending current. So it's not just a one. Recently, there was a newsletter from the Franklin Merrill Wolf Fellowship. And if some of you know, Dr. Franklin Merrill Wolf was our teacher, Joel's teacher. And he produced lots and lots of material in the last 30 years of his life on audio cassette. He wrote several books that are available that are very good. He's very left brain, very, what we call it, a jnani, a master of knowledge. And he had two wives that he outlived. And both times when his wife died, when the wife at the time died, he was very bereft. And even though he was already enlightened, it was very difficult for him. And he felt like he had like a death wish. It was difficult for him to go on. And so that was one of the reasons why he found a second wife, was to be somebody to hold to kind of be a counterpart to his energy, calls it chela. It's a Sanskrit term for like a consort. And when Gertrude, his second wife, died, he was already 90 years old, and she was like 20 years younger than him. So he was really blown away, or 22 years. I think she was maybe 22 years younger. Really was hard. And that was when Andrea and Joel knew Dr. Wolf was in that last part of his life from age 90 to 98. And he worked with the Jungian psychologist Robert Johnson to try to understand what was going on with him. And Robert Johnson suggested that this is because you've externalized your anima, your inner feminine, and you need to learn how to bring that within you. This is a spiritual master at the age of 90. He's still practicing. Okay? So that's what we're talking about here. We want to practice what we realized. It's not like this isn't an escape route. Spirituality is about being real. Okay. Adyashanti, the contemporary spiritual teacher, the Bay Area guy, he discusses this at some length in his book, The End of Your World. And I'm just going to paraphrase, but you can check his book out, it's pretty good. He says that experientially, awakening can be talked about as involving the three centers, the head, the heart, and the gut. In full enlightenment, we have to have all three online, basically. And when he talks about the gut, he talks about it being the deepest layer, which is sort of our clench against life. It's a holding on. It's a very animal. It's not mental at all. And it's deeper than the heart even. It's like reptilian almost. But it can be sensed at the base of the spine, at the pelvic floor. And when we surrender to the love of the mama, we start to let go of this clench. We start to trust in life. We start to have this true faith that life is living through us and it is good. Generally speaking, in my experience, you really only notice the clench when it's gone, because it's so deep and so pervasive to our experience, and pretty much most people have this feeling that we're kind of holding on, right? If we're not running the ship, who is, you know? But as we let go more and more, we start to touch into a deep and timeless release into freedom from any worry, because we are that love. We are actually that love breathing itself. We're not separate from that mother love. So my teacher, healer teacher, Charles Ridley, he says that the shadow, this of course is just generalization, but the shadow of the head is doubt. Shadow meaning, like in Jungian psychology, the part that you don't see, that you need to shine light on so that you can incorporate it into your being. He says in the case of spiritual practice, spiritual realization, the shadow of the head is doubt. The shadow of the heart is hatred. You could say anger, but especially hatred, you know, it's your fault. And the shadow of the belly is fear. So we're talking about freedom from doubt. We no longer worry that we don't know. We know that we don't know. That's the opening of the head. We know that we don't know, and that's okay, because that not knowing is the space that allows everything to happen. Trying to hold on to knowing what the next thing's going to be, well, that's no fun. I mean, we wouldn't want to know what the next thing's going to be. That would, you know, be like a scripted life. Who wants to live in a scripted life? That's letting go of the transcending doubt, incorporating the shadow of the head. The shadow of the heart, the hatred, this is no longer blaming. No, it's nobody, I mean, there's no one else. It's all your heart. So then you can take full responsibility and enjoyment in your life. You're not at odds. This is not easy. You know, this is the first weekend I've had off. I'm obviously not completely off in a month. And last weekend we went up to Seattle, and then Sunday we were driving back, and I drove the whole way because Romy's recovering from a broken ankle, and it's just, you know, that kind of thing is hard on her. And of course, then she got home and did like 2 hours of yard work, and I crashed. So it's a balanced relationship. Anyway, I was getting close to Eugene, and I look in the rearview mirror, and I'm passing somebody going 74. So I'm already going like 9 miles over the speed limit. And this guy is so close that I could basically make out what he was wearing, you know, whether or not he'd brushed his teeth. I mean, he was like right on me. And I mean, there was a moment where I joined hell, you know, with him, and you know, we had our moment, and then, you know, but then I let it go. But that's hatred, right? This is a straight path to hell. If you want to go there, it's not hard. There's plenty of people that'll go with you. And so we need cultivation to remove this hatred. We need to see it over and over again, this anger, and how we are blaming and pointing our fingers out of ourselves, as if, our first precept here, we work with precepts. We do meditation, inquiry, devotion, meaning love for the transcendent, faith, and morality. A lot of spiritual groups, contemporary spiritual groups, skimp on the morality. The traditional ones may be a little heavy-handed with morality. But we like to use precepts because it helps us find when we're operating out of self-centered conditioning, to notice. It's not and we don't compare. You say, I was much better than you last week, and it's not like that. It's a personal thing. But our first precept is responsibility. To take responsibility for my life, not to blame others for my own unhappiness. And it's amazing, though, because we, even though we, practicing this precept and, see the truth and everything, there's still all of these conditional responses to blame. And we do it as a culture, too. We're always looking for whose fault is it? Was it the Republicans? Is it Trump's cabinet? Is it the Democrats? Is it the Arabs or the Mexicans? Or, there's always somebody that's got to be whose fault it is. And then you have your personal relationship, and you're always trying to figure out, whose fault was this argument? But really, this is, so deeply in us. So we want to cultivate, to transform all hatred, completely purify the heart. And then even further cultivation is required. And what is cultivation? Remember, what is the practice? Well, it's to be real, but to notice that you're noticing, that you feel that you're feeling, or feel what it feels like to feel what you're feeling. So notice that you're noticing, that you feel what it feels like to feel what you're feeling. So the hardest one to get to is the last one, in my experience anyway. But this is that gut clench. And when we can let that go, there's no fear. It's gone. And what remains? Well, what's the mama? What's the gut? What's the source of the where the descending current goes to and nurtures us? It's love. That's all that remains. And we see that love is the being consciousness. So you have the consciousness and the being, and that love is the bliss, the innate bliss that is what we are. It's what everything is. It's the Shakti, it's the dance. Sri Muruganar, who's a disciple of the Hindu mystic Ramana Maharshi, he writes, "The experience of self," this is capital S self, "which is nothing but the form of supreme love, is that in which the eyes see only love, the tongue tastes only love, and the touch feels only love, which is bliss." Sure. The experience of self, Atman, which is nothing but the form of supreme love, is that in which the eyes see only love, the tongue tastes only love, and the touch feels only love, which is bliss. In the healing work that Hormy and I are studying, we call this the pure breath of love. So it's the breath of life, but being fully felt, it feels like love. This is innate bliss. So true non-duality, true liberation has to have both truth and love. And it has to include the body. It has to include your day-to-day, right? So this is why it's generally considered kind of a project. So we all are on this road together. It's, I think to try to limit it and make it into something easy and short is a mistake. And there are depths upon depths for us all to experience and explore. So that's what I was hoping to share with you today. Let's see what time it is. Yeah, we've got time for questions. Deanna.
Well, I was kind of curious, the gut part, you said it's fear, and would that be like almost fear of non-existence, or?
Yeah, any fear.
Any fear.
Yeah, Joel talks about the primary distinction. Well, he, in his tenfold chain of conditioning, the chain of conditioning he calls, the first one is the first distinction, and that's the distinction of self and other. And from that, three things happen: loneliness, longing, and fear. Longing to get back to the original unity, which is intuited. We all know it. We just, we know we have happiness somewhere, and we just look for it in the wrong place, right? The loneliness is that feeling of separation, and the fear is the fear of annihilation, because once you're separate, to return to unity feels like death. It feels like annihilation. So that's why a lot of times they talk about, in the Zen koans, they have these koans about being like hanging from your teeth from a branch on a cliff, and there's a tiger above you and a tiger below you, and then there's a berry. And what do you, it's like that, or being standing at the top of a 100-foot pole, and so all that's left is, it's like the fool in the major arcana in the tarot, stepping off a cliff. So that's that moment of awakening, of letting go. But we want that to be through our whole being, if we really want to be free of fear. Yeah. Yeah, Mark?
I was speaking with another local teacher, and they were saying that after realization, it's not that conditioning is gone, but that resistance to it is gone. And so the process of working through it is much different. But that actually doesn't sound quite like what you're saying. It sounds like the conditioning also has in it some resistance or density, or I don't know how you'd say it, but how would you measure that sort of description against what you're saying?
Well, I think probably that I would agree with that person, but without talking to them, I'm not sure. But again, it's terminology. We can get stuck on terminology and whether or not conditioning is a resistance to the conditioning or not. The reality is that until the conditioning is seen thoroughly, it will still trip us up. And so that feels like resistance, because we're getting tripped up, right? But with a realization, then what happens is that you don't have doubt anymore. So the doubt is gone. And so much of our suffering is the mental, oh my gosh, what's going on? And if you can let that go, then it's a much more straightforward process. But what I would say also is that you're most likely, unless in some people's path's different. Like in our teacher Joel's path, my understanding, from reading his autobiography and being around him a lot, is that he essentially exhausted all of his effort and then fell off the cliff backwards. So in the texts I've read, it's less common. It's called full enlightenment, like instantaneously. So much less common. Tends to be people that they're, at least in the contemporary people I know about, like Eckhart Tolle or whatever, that their life exhausted them, and they weren't necessarily like full-time spiritual practitioners for a long period of time. So it, sort of depends. These special cases, but like I said, if you really have this ability to let go of the mind because you've had a realization of the essence of awareness, then you no longer really have doubt. You know what the truth is. Now it's just how do I walk it? How do I find the duh? How do I, as Changzai says, find this enlightenment resulting from sincerity, in which there's no distinction between the way of heaven as being great and the nature of man as being small. As long as we still think that there's something wrong about being human, right? That there's something wrong about being ordinary, that's not real freedom. I mean, you're like living in two ways, it's sort of dichotomous. It's sort of a split personality thing. And so that's also why, in Zen, they know all of this. Zen is a very mature tradition, and the high-level people, it's about acting ordinary. If you read these stories, these accounts of these masters, what's your miracle? Oh, well, when I'm hungry, I eat, and when I'm tired, I sleep. It's very ordinary. So it's thoroughly embodied. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, Maura.
I've been looking at that metaphor of transparency, and you used it. I think you were talking about as a way to maybe process our deep gut feeling. Can you talk about that a little more?
I think transparency could be a synonym for sincerity, so which is kind of what we've been talking about. And most importantly is to be internally transparent, to notice that we're noticing that we feel what it feels like to feel what we're feeling, to really be with our experience. And that takes courage. It takes courage. It takes courage to be exposed even to ourselves. And I would say it can be very useful to have at least one relationship where you expose yourself to that person, because then that gets you to have to be more sincere, more honest with the process. One reason why partnerships can be so powerful is because that process is, especially if both people are on the path. It's difficult if only one is. I mean, everybody's on the path, but there's sort of a conscious path walking and a pre-conscious path walking, right? And so at some point you realize, oh, I'm a spiritual being having a human experience. What am I going to do about this? But because then you can co-creatively work to help each other become more sincere, more transparent, more real with what they're feeling and being. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yes, and I guess the transparency would be like to see through your conditioning, and maybe see through whatever it is that you are having the way of seeing clearly.
Yes. What's in the way of seeing clearly? Generally we have a defense. We have a defense against the wound. There's wounds, but then there's the core wound too. There's generally a big, whopper, and our entire personality actually was created to protect that wound. That was the first fall. It was a prototypical fall from grace, Adam and Eve and so forth, right? We all have that. And in order to return to the Garden of Paradise, we have to, Joel talks about this in the beginning of his autobiography, you have to defeat the guardian. It's like an angel with a sword that goes this way and that way. And what does that represent? It's the intellect. It's the mind and the way that it creates all these separations and dances. It's like it creates a maze, kind of. So that defense, we want to become transparent enough to see that defense in greater and greater operation, and layers too. Everybody's different. Everybody has a unique, this is what Joel says, everybody is absolutely identical in their true nature and absolutely unique in their delusion. So our delusion is all unique. And the way it manifests, and God never repeats herself. It's always a different moment. It's amazing. So anyway, transparent enough to see what the defense is, yes. And that's what practice is. That's what cultivation is, really. It's about finding the resistance and being transparent enough internally that something can happen. There's stillness, you bring enough stillness into that experience that something can happen, some sort of alchemy. Okay, one more from Mark.
I was talking to another person who said something at the time I thought was it was new to me, it was good, and it kind of confirms what you're saying, so I just want to say it, and then you'll respond to whatever. We were talking about fear, and particularly about bodily fear, and maybe, I'd use the example with him of, I once asked Joel, Well, if you were standing on a really high building, but there was a fence there, so you couldn't fall. But there you were on the edge, and you look over, you get that kind of vertigo feeling. I said, would you get that too? Like, would you feel fear, even though there was actually really, even physically, nothing to fear really? And he said, damn right I would, and it's a good thing. It's a good thing. Fear is helpful. And I kept thinking, that doesn't sound right to me. And I asked my other friend about this, and he said, you're looking at this all wrong. It's not like when you wake up, you're not afraid anymore. It's that you're free from the fear. You don't resist it. You're free from caring about it. And so it kind of goes away, not because we've developed in some way, or we've transcended it or whatever, just because it's just another phenomenon. And that really worked for me as a description. I was wondering if it seems similar to what you're saying.
Yeah, so the fear that will go away is the existential fear of annihilation. So the physical fear is, like Joel says, it's a good thing, and it's biological, and we wouldn't want to be without it. We talk about the wisdom energies, the Tibetan teachings on the transforming emotions and so forth. If you throw out the fear and the anger, it's like throwing away precious jewels, because actually they have, desire, jealousy, envy. All of these things actually have within them a transcendent nature. So fear being this energy of clarity, spaciousness, energy, very Shiva, that kind of thing. But there is something in us that is chronically fearful, chronically trying to find a way to feel okay, to feel safe, to feel satisfied, and that is part of our clinch, our resistance. Yeah.
Is that chronic fear the same as anxiety?
Can be, yeah, for sure. I mean, anxiety to me is like a fear that with a little bit of worry in it, it's kind of stirring up the heart, Worry meaning that there's some thinking about it, If it's just fear, like dread, like I've got to get a tooth pulled in an hour, is it going to hurt, But anxiety is, then you're thinking about it, or maybe the day before you're kind of anxious, you don't remember why.
I just have a comment. I had this experience within the last week or two where I was meditating and I had this aha moment of the wad, of the wound. And I just sat with it, and it was woven into my entire being. And that realization was so big that intellectually I couldn't say, well, what am I going to do with this? Because it's so woven. And at that moment, I was able to, as Millarepa's story about jumping into the mouth of the monster. And at that moment, I've just been sitting with it and trying not to fix it, but being with it. So, having that direct experience has really taught me a lot.
Yeah.
And will continue probably the rest of my life.
Yeah, so this is great. And this is exactly why we practice. She said this is an experience she had while meditating, right? A meditative experience. So we can talk about this stuff all we want. We can sit and we can theorize and conditioning and resistance and blah, 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 right? But to actually experience it like a monster woven into the whole life. Yes, that's right. And also, like Rumi says, the wound is where the light enters you. So it's both the shadow and the offering. Your life offering comes through you only because of that wound. If we didn't have a personality, we wouldn't be having this discussion. If we didn't have the wound, we wouldn't have a personality. I mean, just on that basic way that humans are put together, but also intimately in our experience. It's like you go into that and you will find more and more your light. in the darkness. That's where it's hiding. Yeah, David.
I don't have a question, but I want to thank you for being transparent with your process of cultivation. So thank you.
My pleasure. For the good of the whole. Yeah.
So I'd like to follow him up with a question that got raised for me by Shinzen Young, where he has these 3 levels of awareness, the conscious level, the subconscious, and he calls the bottom level source. And he says, for instance, when you experience the monster, that you want to break it apart, to see it not just at the macroscopic level, but at the microscopic level. So as you work with it, you want to see the feelings, I would guess, under the feeling. And it sounded to me like that was the core of his own practice. He's very headset.
Yeah.
And I wondered, was that part of your practice?
Yes, and in fact, we were just talking about that. I mean, I'm putting it in Shinzen Young is a contemporary insight meditation teacher. He's been around teaching for, I don't know, like 4 decades probably. And he just put out a new book. So very experienced teacher and practitioner, trained in Asia. And those methods are very detailed methods for analysis of mental events, emotion, philosophical levels, and all this kind of stuff. So Vipassana is a very deep tradition that he's coming from, and he speaks in a way that's very, like you said, head-centered, left brain. And I'm kind of trying to speak in a little bit more colloquial way here, but what I said was, notice that you're noticing, that you feel what it feels like to feel what you're feeling. How many feelings are there in there? There were 4 and 2 noticings, right? So it's just what you were describing. You want to become very clear with what's going on. As it's arising, though, you can't do this after the fact. You can't feel what you're feeling tomorrow, what you're feeling today, right? You feel what you're feeling tomorrow. So that's why we do formal practice, so that when the juicy stuff comes up, sometimes it comes up in formal practice, a lot of the times it doesn't. It's, the guy behind you who's, riding your ass like that, right? That's, like practice time or not, you know what I mean? And so that, but it becomes over time, as we become familiar with our ghosts and our demons, we become more and more used to their usual antics, and then we have to get more subtle and to see their more subtle antics, their more subtle ways that they still get in the door and cause all sorts of mischief. Yeah. Okay. Good enough? I'm satisfied. All right. Peace to you all.